All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for sticking around. What'd you think of that? Pretty good, right? Yeah. God, I forget how upsetting it is there at the end. Yeah, what a wonderful movie. All right. So right now I'd like to invite our speakers up from... this is really awkward. I don't want to put these on the stools because they roll off and having to sort of juggle some things. All right. I'll go ahead and hand you these.
Thank you.
There you are. All right, folks. Tonight with us we have Laura Adery, Megan Ichinose, Lénie Torregrossa, who are doctoral students in the clinical psychology PhD program and members of the Body, Mind, and Brain Laboratory at Vanderbilt University. Their research touches on topics ranging from the detriments of social isolation and loneliness on perception and social function, abnormal visual and memory processing in schizophrenia, the disrupted sense of self in schizophrenia, and psychotic-like experiences in the general population. So I'm going to be very curious to hear what you all have to say about this film. So we'll start with some brief comments from you all, and then we'll open it up to the floor, so just raise your hand if you've got a question. But yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks for having us. So yeah, we're going to be applying more of a psychosis lens to this film as opposed to maybe like a socio-political perspective. But what we'd like to start off with is kind of the fundamental basis of the film is rooted in this error in information retrieval and information processing. And the parallel that we're going to argue or, make a point to recognize, at least in this aspect, is that psychosis generally starts with errors in information processing and information retrieval. So we study schizophrenia and psychosis, which is characterized by a loss of touch with reality, and that stems from kind of aberrant processing of different types of information. So visual information, auditory information, different information coming in from the environment. So it's disrupted at the most basic sense, and some of my research touches more on those visual perceptual abnormalities. And then those can feed into disrupted kind of higher order issues of processing. So that might lead into, for example, general issues with how we integrate that type of basic information and use it to kind of guide our own decision making and guide our understanding of what's going on in our environment, which plays a crucial role for kind of how we interact with each other socially. So some of the things I'd like to point out for schizophrenia, or how this is related to schizophrenia specifically, is that there's these biases in not only how we interpret other people's kind of affect and what their intentions are towards us, and we call these theory of mind errors, but also there's general biases in, if with people with paranoia in particular, there's biases in seeing things that are more hostile as opposed to more random chance. So from the very beginning of the film, there was this very random chance situation that happened with the bug that fell on the typewriter, which caused the whole issue between the Buttle and Tuttle situation. And from that sparked the entire movie. So it was a kind of a random error, but then it fed into this enormous kind of, kind of a domino effect of all the consequences afterwards. And one of the kind of the trademark delusions in schizophrenia, or what we know to be true, is that they have a jumping to conclusions bias, which is if you give someone like the chances of something that's going to happen randomly, they might attribute it to something that's not actually there. So they might have a tendency towards making meaning and potentially attributing things negatively. So to kind of start off the discussion from there, I gave a lot of little pieces of information, but generally kind of this focus on aberrant information processing and information retrieval. I'd like to open it up to some discussion and some questions you guys might have, or some reflections you might have in the film about what the consequences of information retrieval errors are and how this might lead to a slippery slope. And also parts of the film that were potentially key moments of that information distortion that then, formed the basis for a lot of other scenes in the movie.
Yeah, so does anyone have any sort of comments, ideas, general thoughts about that?
And one of the scenes, really quickly before we open it up to other people, that I think this can be visualized really well, and the director did a good job of this, is that the whole way that information is visually depicted in the film seems to be through this transmission via the ducts and the different channels, and you can kind of tell throughout the movie they become more and more in disarray. So there's wires that are open, the ducts are open, and at like kind of halfway through the film, I don't really know about what point, but at some point Sam returns to his home and the ducts are completely open. Everything's disrupted, and this is kind of this trademark kind of break with reality. It's a real disintegration or decompensation, for example, of the quality of information. So in the beginning, we get this idea that the information can't really be trusted, but by the middle, there's this very clear visual depiction of none of the information is getting where it should be, and it's not being processed accurately.
Yeah, it's so interesting to think of this film in terms of, sort of even the architectural buildup, or, everything in the film is a sort of reflection of maybe the inside of his brain and that disconnection from reality. It's that's a great end point. So if anyone has any comments to that effect, coming to you.
So I was interested in, I forget the main character's name, but when he kind of, in the start of the movie, he was dreaming of meeting Jill, and he had like 3 dreams of meeting her before he actually saw her. And then we discover that he's an unreliable narrator, and it kind of got me thinking about how I've heard that memory can be faulty, that you can have a memory and it's not exactly true. But I've thought about the memories that I have of childhood, and they're memories that I remember remembering. And so it's weird to think that like a memory of childhood could be incorrect, because that means that all those memories of memories and memories of memories of memories must be incorrect. Mm-hmm. So with this movie, we're seeing the dreams in real time. We're seeing the main character dream of Jill a few times before meeting her. But there's also the possibility that once he meets her, he just ascribes this person who's been in his dreams and says that you're the person I've been dreaming of. Mm-hmm. So is it possible to have that happen, where you have this character who will just come up with these multiple memories of dreams? I guess the idea is that, was he actually like seeing in the future? Did he actually recognize her? Or could that have just been an on-the-spot, immediate hallucination of all those past dreams we saw earlier?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I knew. I think it could definitely be that. It could be a mix of both. There's something called memory reconsolidation. That's a popular theory of how delusions get solidified, I guess, in schizophrenia research. And that's that every time that we bring up a memory, that it's reconsolidated given and adjusted given the current context in which it's reintroduced. So, for example, if you're having this childhood memory, whatever you're doing at that current moment and the mood state that you're in at that current moment is going to be then reconsolidated as a part of that memory. So when you bring it up in the future, that current context that you had before is now a part of that memory. So in a sense, that every time you're bringing up a new memory, it's liable to different types of effects of the current, your own current state, in a way that the actual memory is a distant past. So in that sense, it could be that every time when he actually sees Jill, it's really not Jill, it's kind of this projection of her, or every time he's having an interaction with her, he's reconsolidating that memory to fit with his prior beliefs about the situation.
And if I can address that point really quickly, I'm glad you brought up the memory thing. I was going to talk about this a little bit. So at the beginning, it seems like you spotted on that, but the first time he actually sees Jill, it seems like it's a déjà vu. And that's something that we would consider a subclinical psychotic experience. It's something that a lot of people experience. I'm sure people in the audience here have had such experiences before. So that's not something that we consider a symptom, but it's definitely on the spectrum. It's closer to a delusion, but it's not quite clinical yet because it's not typically as distressing. And I think bringing up memory is also important because we know that people who have schizophrenia have very important deficits in autobiographical memory. And it seems like we know that autobiographical memories are very important for our sense of self and developing a sense of identity. And so if Sam is having trouble with his memory, then it might be very difficult for him to create a cohesive image of who he is as a person, and that's thought to be one of the core trademark of schizophrenia, for example.
And we also know, I mean, we saw kind of the culture built around Sam and kind of within Sam's own life, this culture of distrust and mistrust and kind of breeding paranoia. And this is something that patients or people with schizophrenia often deal with is kind of persecutory delusions or feelings of persecution, or that, you know, this mistrust or this paranoia is a pretty hallmark feature for many individuals with schizophrenia. And so we can see how within kind of that environment, the updating that he might be doing to the memories or to, you know, his sense of self is kind of incorporating more of these themes of distrust or paranoia and kind of leading to this sort of disintegration.
Got someone back here.
Recently, I've been reading about chronostasis and backpropagation of experiences into blank spots in real time. So, but they're very short, sort of 500 milliseconds of your brain animating something back in time, so that it synchronizes with the rest of your experience. And I wonder if there's any research or study done in the area of whether within that 500 milliseconds you can have a sense of something that's actually much bigger chronologically. So this question came up right at the beginning with the first fellow who was talking about, you know, were all those early dreams just an instant where it was all back propagated? Any comment on that phenomenon?
I'm not aware of any studies like that. I don't know if you guys have. I'm not sure it's been researched in schizophrenia yet.
I'm not sure.
There's definitely deficits in time perception in people with schizophrenia, but that's not, I don't think it's as specific as what you're exactly talking about, but I'm aware of studies where they ask people with schizophrenia to estimate how long, you know, a period of time is, and they seem to be very off, and that seems to contribute to the fragmented sense of self.
And then there's also very well-established deficits in very short-term memory across a lot of different modalities, particularly visuospatial modalities. So you could imagine, you could hypothesize a cool study where you're looking at deficits in time and short-term memory to see how that relates to kind of that sense of what happened in the last 500 milliseconds. Because even the short-term memory deficits are on such a time scale on the millisecond time scale. So even after something's immediately disappeared from actual presentation, you see deficits as early as that. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's contributing to kind of this ongoing like kind of loss of touch with reality.
Hi, I have a question. If in my job, sometimes I'm talking with folks who have schizophrenia about episodes in their lives where there's a legal question, and so you ask them about like what was your thinking, what was your understanding of what this person was doing, of what you were doing, what you thought, you know, who you thought they were, that kind of stuff. How accurate would you say that their recollection would be of these kind of episodes after, when they're more stable and, you know, in those moments, you know, during a period where their symptoms are not active?
I mean, that's a great question, because this is a great example of how there's really real implications in the day-to-day life for patients with schizophrenia and people who are kind of working with them and having to make decisions about their narrative and, you know, the quality of the narrative. I think, Meg, you know, your work is kind of most related to that. Maybe you could speak on the...
So there's been, and Lénie as well, we've done some work on autobiographical memory recall. Generally, there's poor recall, but it's been looked at fairly in recent. So someone comes into the lab like and then they're tested on memory a week later. So it's not something, several years later or at a time in their life that might have been particularly salient. Generally, when people are comparing autobiographical memories between people with schizophrenia and people without, there's differences qualitatively in terms of the types of, the types of words, and then also the number of words. So just in terms of the amount of details that someone's able to produce is fewer, but that doesn't really remark on the accuracy of it.
And I think even beyond the memory problem, there's an issue in people with schizophrenia to know what's going on. It's very hard for them to self-reflect on what's happening. So when you ask someone, okay, so, are you in touch with reality right now? It's a very hard question to reflect, so let alone later in time. I think it definitely is an issue.
And then just kind of back to kind of what we were talking about a little bit earlier with attribution bias, the kind of uptake of the information at the time might have been colored or skewed by their attribution at the time, or by symptoms that they were having at the time that caused them to integrate the information either inaccurately or with a more kind of hostile picture. And so that's something that we would maybe want to consider as well in kind of thinking about the reality versus the perceptions and attributions that might have been going on. It's a great question.
All right, do we have any more questions out there? All right.
I hate to bring this up because I think it's a cheap gimmick in movies and TV. I mean, you wake up and Bobby's alive in the shower all of a sudden. But the implication at the end of the movie is that he dreamed all this stuff, or it was all an illusion. What are the odds? I mean, I've had dreams that were so vivid that I woke up the next morning and thought, wow, did that really happen? What are the chances of something like that actually happening to someone where they had something so vivid, like this guy was tortured or whatever, that he thought this whole thing happened and he was tortured or whatever for some other completely different reason?
So that actually is a really nice segue with something we were going to talk about, which was how do delusions serve a purpose, and also how they might relate to trauma, because there's a lot of research that's looking at dissociative experiences in relation to early experiences of trauma in life and how they might serve a purpose, in that if you're experiencing something really traumatic, it's actually functional for then your body to not process what's going on exactly in the moment psychologically. And a number of individuals with psychosis and schizophrenia have had earlier trauma in life. So that is like one mechanistic explanation, right? And I'm not sure, more specifically to the question of how likely it is to kind of have these really vivid dreams and wake up and have it all be a lack of reality, but, and again, that could be potentially something where it's graded on a spectrum across individuals, where you might have some experiences that seem vivid, but it's still in the context of reality. Whereas if someone's full-blown psychotic, there's no distinction between what's reality and what's not. Everything is kind of a full loss of touch with reality. So, which is what we experienced at the end of the movie. But what's interesting about the movie to me is that it's kind of the gradual deterioration, right? So initially the dreams are very vivid and separate from the reality world of the film, but by the end of it, those two are seamlessly integrated so that you can't really tell what's real, what's not.
Yeah, and I was going to elaborate on that a little bit, but to address your question, I think something that's important, and we're watching a movie, so those experiences need to be portrayed on a screen, so there's a lot of visual elements, but typically hallucinations in schizophrenia are more auditory. I think it's pretty rare to have a full, vivid visual experience. There's definitely visual hallucinations, but having someone who completely almost dreams very vividly of something happening before their eyes for multiple minutes, I think that would be quite rare. And so to address a little bit this progressive worsening of the symptoms, I think it's very interesting when we think about the course of illness in schizophrenia. So it's kind of hard to talk about a typical trajectory because there's a lot of variability in people, and that's why it's a very hard disease to study. But so in the case of Sam, like we've touched on already a little bit, it seems to start pretty mildly. So those experiences start happening only when he's asleep or about to be asleep, and actually that's something we screen out typically. So when we try to interview someone and ask them about their experience to try to establish a diagnosis of schizophrenia, and we ask about hallucinations and psychotic experiences, if the person endorses it, then we have to ask them if that only happens right before they fall asleep or right after they wake up. And if it only happens then that wouldn't really qualify as a clinical symptom, just because that's very common in the general population. So I don't know if people have had experiences where you're about to fall asleep and you hear something, maybe a little more than a cracky noise, or even, just that's outside of the sleeping thing, but I don't know if you've ever been in a crowd and turned around because you heard your name being called, but there definitely wasn't. Those are experiences that everyone has, but you see how they're getting closer to those hallucinations. So I think it's important to remind us here that a lot of those experiences are not all or nothing. They're on a spectrum, and the general population experiences them. It's just that the frequency and the intensity is typically a little bit lower. And what seems to be happening to Sam is that progressively throughout the movie, there is a worsening and the distress that comes with those experiences, as well as the frequency. I think they start to, at the beginning, to me, they were almost enjoyable. Maybe I felt like they were like this nice dream where it was this angel-like figure flying around, and maybe that was enjoyable. And then they start happening more when he is in distress. And I think the first time I noticed that in the movie was after the two people from Central Information come to fix his AC and figure out that he's been, getting it fixed by someone else. That's very distressing to him. And that's when he starts having this longer episode that's more distressing. And so it's important here to note that he was stressed out at this point, because that points to the onset of schizophrenia and what we know of it. Again, we don't have it figured out yet, but we know that genetics play a role, but we also know that environment plays a role, and so this genetic vulnerability needs to be combined with very stressful environmental factors for a psychotic experience to happen and for the first episode of psychosis to happen. And then, talking about typical trajectory, people usually, it is pretty progressive in typical cases. But for most people, there is one moment that we call the first psychotic episode, and that's a very critical moment in the life of someone with schizophrenia, because the deterioration that happens at that time, both functionally but also at the brain level, is thought to be pretty irreversible. So it's very important to be able to recognize the symptoms early and to seek for treatment, because typically it takes several years or months at least to find a treatment that's going to be suitable for that person. And a scary number is that the average length of duration of this untreated first psychotic episode is currently 1 year. So that means that your average person is experiencing a full-blown psychosis for about 1 year before they seek treatment. So you can only start to imagine all the damage that happens both in their lives, their body, and their brain. So that's really the moment where we think things shift. And I was actually curious to see if people in the audience had a sense of when you think that may have been happening in the movie. I don't think there's a very clear-cut answer. I have a few insight, but did you guys have a sense of when there seems to be just this switch that's happening where maybe Sam is entering full-blown psychosis? Yeah. Anyone else?
Any other? Yeah, we got one over here. Hold on, I'll bring you the mic. Sorry.
I think the moment in the department store after the bomb goes off and his dream breaks into reality and he grabs the piece of debris as a sword, I think that's pretty clear to me when his delusion really takes hold.
Absolutely. I mean, I think too, whether they were intentionally doing it or not, the movie did a great job sort of metaphorically depicting that it does become sort of, from separate situations to kind of this integration where the lines become blurred, hence our title, and reality and unreality become this kind of seamless, kind of untangleable scenario for people where it isn't clear anymore what's real and what's not. And it gets kind of incorporated into reality, and the delusions sort of pieces of reality get incorporated into delusions in order to fit with the reality that has been created by the delusion.
And I think it's not only the line between reality and imagination or delusion that becomes blurred, it's also the line between the self and the other. I think the movie, again, I can't say if they did it intentionally or not, but did a really nice depiction of this at the scene again in the mall where you see Sam fighting Jill, but against a mirror, so it looks like he's fighting himself. I thought that was just a very nice visual of that. And the other point is when he's fighting this warrior, robot, soldier, giant thing, and then he, kills it or at least injures it, and then removes the mask and discovers that it's himself. So you can really start to see this, who is Sam? Where does he end? Is he fighting himself? And that's something that people with schizophrenia really tend to experience a lot, this loss of boundary between the self and the other, or the self and the world in general.
Yeah, this time around I picked up on a couple other things, like the Ministry of Information stands for moi, for myself, like me. And then interestingly, like we study in our lab a lot that blurred body boundary between self and other, and differences in perspective. So it turns out individuals with schizophrenia or who are psychosis prone, have more frequent out-of-body experiences. And the perspective of the film, it was really interesting. I think from the beginning, you're kind of disoriented, and part of that is because sometimes the perspective of the camera will go from Sam's perspective, sometimes it will go from outside of Sam's perspective, and it has all these weird perspectives where you don't really know which body you're in a lot of times. So I thought that was kind of a nice parallel to a lot of stuff we study.
All right, guys. Well, thank you so much. That was wonderful. And feel free to continue the conversation in the lobby. But thank you all so much for being here. And thanks to Laura, Lénie, and Megan for being here with us. Please come back next week when we're watching Songcatcher. Thanks, guys.